blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 2nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: bets made on Kalshi and Polymarket about the fate of Iran's leader before the U.S. and Israel attacked the regime are drawing sometimes angry reactions from U.S. lawmakers and others who challenge the propriety of such wagers. Layoffs at fintech firm Block last week added momentum to a growing backlash at American companies against the prospect of mass unemployment caused by the wider use of artificial intelligence tools. Paradigm, one of the largest venture investors focused on crypto, is expanding its brief to include artificial intelligence, robotics, and other forms of advanced technology. Berkshire Hathaway's new chief executive, Greg Abel, laid out a vision for the conglomerate that signaled he would stick with what worked for his predecessor, Warren Buffett. Auto parts supplier First Brands is hastening to sell its brands in bankruptcy to avoid liquidation within roughly 2 months. Scream 7 led the weekend domestic box office, pulling in $64.1 million at the movie's debut. Early last year, a cluster of data centers in Virginia suddenly dropped off the power grid, threatening the stability of the state's already vulnerable system for a second time in a span of months. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. U.S. and Israeli airstrikes pummeled Iran for a second day following the killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei, as Tehran responded with a retaliatory barrage that threatened to further destabilize the region. Khamenei's death brought a sense of disbelief to a nation divided over his legacy, as supporters gathered in mourning and opponents celebrated his demise. Oil prices surged after the tit-for-tat strikes across the Middle East, leaving Wall Street bracing for the economic fallout of an extended regional war. The FAA is considering cuts to flights this summer at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, where United and American Airlines are competing for arrival and departure slots. 2 people were killed and 14 were injured in a shooting in Austin, Texas, that law enforcement said may be connected to terrorism. Over 4 dozen House members have decided not to seek re-election, and the number could potentially rise to a record for a midterm. FBI Director Patel's attraction to the spotlight is chipping away at the Bureau's buttoned-down image and unnerving some of its personnel. Afghanistan thwarted airstrikes on Bagram Air Base amid continued cross-border conflict with Pakistan. Died Ali Khamenei, 86, Iran's supreme leader. The picture on today's front page is a composite of 4 photos showing the American, Israeli, and Iranian flag in Tokyo, Istanbul, New York, and London, where people are celebrating. The headline, U.S., Israel intensify attacks on Iran. Tehran hits back around region after Khamenei's death. 3 U.S. troops killed. By Laura Segelman, Elisa Lutpat, and Anat Peled. U.S. and Israeli airstrikes pummeled Iran for a second day on Sunday, a day after the killing of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as Tehran responded with a retaliatory barrage that threatened to further destabilize the Middle East. 3 U.S. troops were killed during the operation in Iran that began early Saturday, and 5 others were seriously wounded, the U.S. Military Central Command said on Sunday. President Trump warned Sunday that there would likely be more U.S. casualties as the military continues strikes against Iran. Israel and the U.S. have struck 2,000 targets since the start of their joint military campaign in Iran on Saturday morning, 2 people briefed on the operation said. Targets have included senior military and political officials such as Khamenei and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leaders, aerial defense systems, ballistic missiles and launchers, intelligence targets, and command centers. The countries on Sunday said they had destroyed critical IRGC infrastructure. Yesterday, a large-scale U.S. strike cut off the head of the snake. America has the most powerful military on earth, and the IRGC no longer has a headquarters, U.S. Central Command said in a social media post alongside a video showing airstrikes on several buildings. The UK will allow the U.S. to use its military bases to conduct defensive strikes against missile storage depots and launchers in Iran, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said on Sunday. In Iran and abroad, reactions to Khamenei's death ranged from euphoria to grief to violence, providing an early glimpse of the dangerous uncertainty ahead. Opponents of the Iranian regime staged demonstrations in cities across the world Sunday to celebrate the wave of U.S. and Israeli attacks that killed the country's hardline leader. Many protesters waved Iranian flags that predate the revolution of 1979. As news spread late Saturday that the U.S. and Israeli strikes had killed the Ayatollah, many Iranians poured onto the streets of Tehran, Karaj, Rash, and other major cities to celebrate. A man in Karaj, northern Iran, told the Wall Street Journal that people are invigorated again, seeing a glimmer of hope after anti-government protests were violently put down in early January. But the joy was short-lived, he said, as authorities fired gunshots to break up the celebrations. As attacks continued on Sunday morning, Iran's state-controlled media outlets, IRNA and IRIB, aired videos of masses of people mourning Khamenei in cities such as Tehran, Meanwhile, Iran's state-run IRNA news agency reported that the death toll in a Saturday strike at a girls' school in southern Iran had risen to 165, including students, parents, and school staff. The Israeli military said it wasn't aware of strikes in the area. The U.S. military said it was looking into the reports, the Associated Press reported. Trump told The Atlantic on Sunday that Iran wants to resume negotiations with the U.S. They want to talk, and I have agreed to talk, so I will be talking to them, Trump said. They should have done it sooner. They should have given what was very practical and easy to do sooner. They waited too long. Trump spoke with the leaders of Israel, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates on Sunday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said. Omani Foreign Minister on Sunday said on X that the door to diplomacy remains open. Reaction from members of Congress was mixed, with Democratic senators on Sunday questioning the grounds for U.S. intervention. U.S. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said he believed Trump didn't have the right to commit the U.S. to war with Iran without permission from Congress. While Warner thought eliminating Iran's top leaders was good for the world, he said, I fear that we are seeing just the opening salvos of what could be not an in and out conflict, but what could be a sustained war in the region. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said on CBS that the U.S.'s priority is destroying Iran's missile arsenal in a campaign that could take weeks. Iran, on Sunday, hit multiple targets around the region. It fired missiles at Riyadh's International Airport in Saudi Arabia, as well as Prince Sultan Air Base, home to U.S. military personnel, senior Gulf officials said. The missiles were intercepted and no material damage was done, they said. Drones hit Erbil International Airport in northern Iraq, which also houses a U.S. military base, a senior U.S. official said, adding that the base was hit but not significantly damaged and there were no casualties. 3 commercial vessels around the Strait of Hormuz were attacked on Sunday, a British Navy watchdog said, while the UAE Defense Ministry said 2 Iranian drones hit a naval base in the country's capital, Abu Dhabi. The United Arab Emirates, which hosts a U.S. base, has been a target of Iran's retaliatory attacks with strikes on a major port, international airport, and at least 2 hotels. The Defense Ministry said 3 people have been killed and 58 others have been injured in Iranian attacks. On Sunday, the UAE said it is closing its embassy in Tehran and withdrawing its ambassador and diplomatic staff. Iran targeted a U.S. Navy facility in Bahrain, according to a social media post by the U.S. Central Command. Central Command rebuffed Iran's claim that it had struck the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln with ballistic missiles, saying in a social media post that the weapons didn't even come close. In a Saturday social media post, Trump said the U.S. had destroyed and sunk 9 Iranian warships. U.S. forces struck and sank an Iranian naval vessel, Central Command said. The Gulf Cooperation Council, a bloc comprising the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, meeting in an extraordinary session on Sunday, condemned what it described as Iranian missile and drone attacks on member states, calling the strikes violations of sovereignty and international law. Israel's military said Sunday that it was preparing to call up about 100,000 reservists in what would be one of the largest mobilizations of its reservists since October 7, 2023, to fill roles for defensive and offensive operations, particularly in border areas across the country. On Sunday, Israel suffered one of the deadliest single attacks on its soil since the October 7th Hamas-led killings. 9 people were killed when buildings collapsed following an Iranian strike in the central city of Shemesh, said Magen David Adom, Israel's emergency medical services. The Israeli military said it was striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon after the Iranian-backed group launched a projectile into Israel. Israeli officials said the country's Air Force has freedom over Tehran. You're going to see hard strikes on IRGC, Basij, and other regime-related targets to make the message clear. This war is not about the missiles or nuclear. It's really about a new regime for the Iranian people, said Avner Galof, a former Israeli national security official and now vice president at MIND, Israel, an advisory institute. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Continuing with articles from the front page. After denouncing U.S. intervention, Trump topples foreign leaders, by Vera Bergengruen and Meredith McGraw. In front of a packed chamber of Arab political and business leaders last May, President Trump declared that the era of American-led regime change was over. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, he said in Riyadh, deriding the Western interventionalist giving you lectures on how to live and how to govern your own affairs. 9 months later, he launched the largest U.S. military operation the region had seen in 2 decades and urged Iranians to take over their government, backed by U.S. force. It marked a jarring reversal for a man whose political rise was fueled in part by American fatigue with large-scale military interventions. For years, Trump denounced Washington's forever wars and warned against toppling foreign regimes by force, a message that formed the foundation of the America First movement that won him the presidency twice. Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury was driven by frustration that Iran wouldn't cut a deal to constrain its nuclear program, his longtime personal grievances against Tehran, and a new conviction among the president and his top advisors after January's operation in Venezuela that regime change didn't have to mean another Iraq, according to administration officials and others familiar with Trump's thinking. It was also shaped by Trump's desire to achieve in Iran what no U.S. president had in almost 50 years. For months, allies from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Republican lawmakers told Trump that the Iranian government was the weakest it had ever been and urged him to seize a once-in-a-generation opportunity to decapitate the regime, the people said. The joint military mission with Israel killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and many of his top officials on Saturday. Buoyed by what he viewed as the success of the U.S. operation that deposed Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro, Trump came to believe that he had found a new playbook, one that could bring down a hostile leader, extract concessions, and leave the transition to its people without committing to an open-ended U.S. involvement. It's a blueprint Trump and some of his advisors have discussed using in Cuba in hopes of toppling a regime they have recently designated as an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. It's a risky gambit. In Venezuela, the U.S. captured Maduro but didn't call on the country to take over the government, instead working with government insiders and promising an eventual transition. In Iran, the killing of Khamenei and many in his inner circle risks triggering a wider regional conflict that could destabilize the country and mire the U.S. in another war in the Middle East. It's also one constrained by hard logistics. The U.S. military is burning through scarce air defense interceptors faster than it can replace them, raising concerns about how long it can sustain this tempo, while continuing to protect U.S. forces and partners from retaliation. John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, spent years trying to push the president toward regime change in Iran. But Trump ousted Bolton amid disagreements over foreign policy and later dismissed him as a war hawk. If I listened to him, Trump wrote on social media in 2020, we would be in World War VI by now. Bolton said Saturday's strikes left him stunned. I'm as surprised as anybody, he said. The operation to decapitate the government of a country of roughly 92 million people is unlikely to give Trump the one-and-done kind of approach he prefers, Bolton said. Trump wants to say it's been a success, total victory, and now I leave it up to the opposition to finish the overthrow of the government. Trump's most dramatic foreign intervention yet also comes as polls show that voters are souring on his focus on foreign policy months before the 2026 midterm elections. In a recent Wall Street Journal poll, voters disapprove of Trump's priorities by an 11-point margin, with 53% saying that he is choosing to engage in unnecessary foreign affairs instead of the economy, compared with 42% who say he is dealing with urgent national security threats. In recent months, Trump has increasingly become convinced he can use an overwhelming display of U.S. power to force out three of Washington's most entrenched adversaries in a single term: Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. Tehran's strikes across Gulf deepen resolve to retaliate, by Yaroslav Trofimov, Dubai. The Iranian regime, decapitated in the first hours of the U.S.-Israeli campaign that started Saturday, has responded by striking at least 9 countries across the Middle East, unleashing a truly regional war. The apparent calculation was that by targeting rich Persian Gulf monarchies that hold sway with the Trump administration, Tehran could force Washington and Israel into a rapid de-escalation. Iran's expectation was that by squeezing oil shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and disrupting air traffic, it would cause unbearable pain to the Gulf nations that depend so much on expatriate workers, tourism, and overseas trade. So far, this calculus seems to have backfired. Gulf states, rattled by volleys of Iranian drones and missiles targeting their hotels, ports, and airports, are concluding the Iranian peril must be confronted. Rather than seeking an off-ramp, the prevailing mood in the Gulf, at least for now, is that the Iranian regime can't be allowed to get away with this unprecedented onslaught on its neighbors. Iran is coming to the countries and people of the Gulf and saying, I am actually your number one threat. This has long-term implications regardless whoever is actually in power in Iran. Anwar Gargash, diplomatic advisor to the United Arab Emirates president, said, targeting Gulf states is completely irrational and very short-sighted. Iran has struck all 6 of the oil-rich Gulf Arab states, including Oman, which mediated nuclear talks between Tehran and the Trump administration. It also hit Jordan, Iraq, and Israel. At first, all the Gulf states publicly opposed the U.S.-Israeli assault on the Iranian regime, which resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the killing of many Iranian military and intelligence commanders. The mood changed quickly when the brunt of the Iranian response targeted cities such as Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the UAE, Doha in Qatar, and Manama in Bahrain, inflicting widespread damage to infrastructure and civilian casualties. In the UAE alone, Iran killed 3 people and injured 58 after firing 165 ballistic missiles and 541 drones, most of which were intercepted, according to the Ministry of Defense. Many people in the Gulf woke up Saturday pissed off at the United States and Israel and went to sleep pissed off at Iran, said William Wexler, Director of Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council in Washington, and a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. In Europe, too, even though ties with the U.S. have frayed since President Trump's re-election, the initial apprehension over the attack on Iran has turned to tacit approval, especially after some Iranian missiles on Sunday were intercepted on their way to Cyprus, a member state of the European Union. Germany, France, and the UK, which didn't participate in the initial strikes on Iran, said Sunday they will take steps to defend our interest and those of our allies in the region, potentially through enabling necessary and proportionate defensive action to destroy Iran's capability to fire missiles and drones at their source. Kaja Kallas, who leads the European Commission's foreign and security policy, said, "What comes next is uncertain, but there is now an open path to a different Iran, one that its people may have greater freedom to shape." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Articles from the editorial page, where there are now two rather long articles on Iran. In the first one, Trump enforces his red line on Iran. His war aims suggest a long campaign that could topple the regime. The U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran that began Saturday morning is a necessary act of deterrence against a regime that is the world's foremost promoter of terrorism. It carries risks, as all wars do, but it also has the potential to reshape the Middle East for the better and lead to a safer world. In his 8-minute video in the wee hours Saturday, President Trump laid out war aims that suggest a campaign of several days or weeks. He said he wants to raze their missile industry to the ground and annihilate their navy. He will destroy what's left of Iran's nuclear program and ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces. Crucially, he called on the people of Iran to rise up and depose the theocratic regime that has terrorized and murdered them for 47 years. When we are finished bombing, Mr. Trump said, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. These war aims mean that Mr. Trump is enforcing the red lines he drew when the regime slaughtered its people as they protested in January. He said he'd come to their aid, and now he has. He also gave Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, ample chance to strike a deal on nuclear weapons and its missile force, but the Ayatollah refused and he was killed in the attack. Mr. Trump has unduly criticized his predecessors for forever wars in the Middle East, but he understands deterrence. In Yemen, Iran in June, Venezuela, and now in Iran again. He has taken action against manifest threats in his second term that Barack Obama and Joe Biden refused to take. U.S. deterrence collapsed, and the world's rogues took advantage. The scale of the military action means the campaign can succeed even if the regime survives. Destroying Iran's missiles and navy will make the region safer. The nuclear program will be difficult and expensive to rebuild, especially if the U.S. also continues to block Iran's oil exports, its main revenue source. The larger gamble is regime change, and no one knows if this will happen. Air campaigns alone rarely topple a dictatorship. But if the U.S. and Israel take long enough to kill enough regime leaders, WSJ militia, and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the chance for an internal coup or popular revolt might open up. Even if the result is that less radical members of the IRGC take over, they are likely to be better than the Ayatollahs. Let's hope the Mossad and CIA are on the ground trying to help the opposition. The biggest challenge to the military campaign may be at home more than in Iran. Critics in the U.S. are already out in force, and they will exploit American casualties like the 3 servicemen killed and 5 wounded on the weekend. One cliche is that this is a war of choice, and there was no urgent threat to address. But the regime and its proxies are weaker now than they have been since the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Would the critics prefer to wait until Iran has rebuilt its air defenses and missile stockpiles with the help of Russia and China? Then more Americans would probably die. Critics also claim the war is illegal because Congress hasn't voted for it. But the Constitution gives presidents ample room to use military force against threats to U.S. security. Members of Congress may demand a vote on a war powers resolution that could block military action after 60 days. We think the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. But by all means, let's see who in Congress wants to side with Iran, given all the Americans its forces have killed over the decades. Another common alarm is that toppling the regime could lead to civil war in Iran and new conflicts among other powers in the region, such as Turkey and the Saudis. Events are impossible to predict, but it's hard to imagine instability greater than what the revolutionary regime has promoted for nearly 5 decades. The most glib criticism is that the president who claims to be a peacemaker has contradicted himself by using force against adversaries 4 times in 13 months. But Mr. Trump inherited a world in which an axis of U.S. adversaries had formed and was on the march. He is pressuring that axis at its weakest links in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. In doing so, he is sending a message to China and Russia that the cost of testing Mr. Trump militarily are considerable. Our main concern is that Mr. Trump may stop too soon. He will face political pressure from the Tucker Carlson right and perhaps Mr. Carlson's allies in the vice president's circle, as well as from Democrats and most of the press. This is especially true if there are more U.S. casualties. Mr. Trump was wise to warn about this in his video remarks, but he will have to keep making the case for his war aims and that achieving them takes time. Mr. Trump didn't begin a war on Saturday. He is fighting back against an Iranian regime that has been waging war against the U.S., Israel, and the West for decades. The threat is the regime itself, and let's hope it falls. It's too soon for Iran off-ramps. That was George H.W. Bush's mistake in the first Gulf War. The first 2 days of the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran have been a striking success, but the response of the Iranian regime has also revealed the reason it was necessary. The biggest mistake President Trump could make now would be to end the war too soon, before Iran's military and its domestic terror forces have been more thoroughly destroyed. The precise targeting of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and some 40 regime leaders is a remarkable demonstration of U.S. and Israeli intelligence capability. It underscores how much last June's attack had degraded Iran's capacity to compete in the skies or mount a major retaliatory response. 3 Americans were killed and 5 wounded on the weekend, but the risk of casualties would be greater had the president waited to let Iran rearm. Iran's retaliation also shows the risk the regime continues to pose to its Arab neighbors as well as to the U.S. and Israel. Iran's interim leader is Ali Larijani, a main deputy to Khamenei, who runs the Supreme National Security Council. He rose in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, during its heyday under the late and unlamented Qasem Soleimani. On Saturday, Mr. Larijani promised retribution against the U.S., and you can bet he means it. He will be in charge until the religious leaders choose a successor. Mr. Larijani's prominence ensures that Iran's elected president, Masoud Pezeshkian, will continue to be a bit player. The Revolutionary Guard and the Basij paramilitary forces still run the country. Iran's military retaliation is notable for hitting more or less every one of its neighbors. As we write this on Sunday, Iran has fired missiles or drones on Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and even Oman, which was negotiating with the U.S. on Iran's behalf. It also launched strikes, if fewer of them, on Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and perhaps even Cyprus. Some of its targets in these countries are U.S. bases, but the attacks were often directed at civilian targets, including hotels in Dubai. A senior Israeli and U.S. official tells us the UAE's leaders are hanging tough rather than urging the two nations to quit. The attacks underscore that Iran is the main threat to the entire region. What it has been doing all along by proxy, it now does directly. This is an opportunity to rally even the region's equivocating states into a coalition for changing the Tehran regime. All of this reveals the risks of ending the bombing campaign before Mr. Trump's stated war aims are achieved. Mr. Trump has said he will respond to continued Iran retaliation with more bombing, but he also told Axios that he is open to off-ramps if the regime seeks to resume diplomacy. What precisely those ramps are isn't clear, but he told The Atlantic on Sunday that Iran's new leaders want to talk, and I have agreed to talk. The regime may promise more seeming concessions to entice Mr. Trump to stop the bombing and give it a lifeline. This would raise the risk of ending before Iran's navy and its missile stocks, launchers, and productive capacity are destroyed. It would also leave most of the IRGC and its Basij enforcers intact. As long as these remain in control, the regime will be able to shoot to kill protesters and cow any domestic uprising. The longer the bombing destroys regime targets, the likelier that fissures will open in the leadership and perhaps lead to an internal coup or the collapse of the regime's willingness to slaughter its own people in the streets. The war doesn't need to continue until the regime falls, but it does need to keep going long enough to destroy far more of its military and its internal killing machine. Critics of the bombing cite George W. Bush and risk of forever war a la Iraq. But no one, least of all Mr. Trump, is talking about deploying U.S. troops to Iran to install a new government. That is the job of Iranians. The better analogy is George H.W. Bush and the first Gulf War in 1990. The coalition campaign was so successful in pushing Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait that Bush and his advisors stopped too soon and spared most of his military. The long persecuted Shiites of southern Iraq staged an uprising against the Sunni troops, but were massacred. Saddam stayed in power and remained a threat that led to the invasion of 2003. The U.S. didn't need to occupy Baghdad in 1990. But a longer campaign to degrade Saddam's military would have given the people of Iraq a better chance of creating a safe zone in the south, as the Kurds were able to do in the north with the help of U.S. air cover. This doesn't imply a forever bombing campaign in Iran, but it does mean continuing as long as it takes to ensure that, even if the regime doesn't fall, it will no longer be a threat to its neighbors, and perhaps it can be weakened enough that its people can muster the ability to install a government that wants to be a normal nation again, rather than one that seeks to spread revolution and kill Jews, Sunni Arabs, and Americans. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, Venezuela's bogus amnesty law. Conditional release of a minority of political prisoners is far from a win for democracy. By Mary Anastasia O'Grady. Venezuela's National Assembly passed what it calls the amnesty law on February 19th. Dictator Delcy Rodriguez signed it almost immediately. Its title suggests the regime is moving toward national reconciliation by extinguishing the spurious, fake records it created of crimes it claims its opponents committed. The text says something very different. Yes, under this law, some regime targets may be forgiven for crimes of which they were never convicted before an independent judiciary. Bravo! You're pardoned for something you never did. But many others, including opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, are excluded from the blanket absolution. Proclaiming this an amnesty, as one Venezuelan told me, is pure propaganda. The question is whether the Trump administration will let the unpopular Miss Rodriguez get away with it. 2 months ago, she was the mere deputy to strongman Nicolas Maduro, and things didn't look good for the regime. U.S. sanctions meant Venezuela could sell its oil only on the black market at a discount, and Caracas was low on dollars. There was a huge U.S. Navy buildup off the country's Caribbean coast. Missile strikes on the alleged drug-running boats were hurting the regime's narcotics trade, and a potentially devastating U.S. attack on land seemed imminent. President Trump gave the go-ahead for Operation Absolute Resolve on January 3rd. Shock and awe over the Venezuelan capital followed. Mr. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were captured and taken to New York to stand trial on narco-trafficking charges. But Ms. Rodriguez emerged unscathed and was immediately promoted, making her commander-in-chief of Venezuela's armed forces and security forces. More good news for Ms. Rodriguez came when the U.S. decided it could work with her. U.S. officials, including Energy Secretary Chris Wright, had traveled to Venezuela for photo ops with the dictator. Ms. Wright has endorsed the police state as a destination for capital. Venezuelan oil, previously restricted by sanctions, now sells at market prices. Some income from those sales, which can include purchases by China and Cuba, goes to the regime. It's supposed to use these profits to pay for imports and other economic needs. Daily life is improving for Venezuelans, and the regime is more secure than it has been in months. Mr. Trump says the U.S. now runs Venezuela, and he wants Ms. Rodriguez to release all political prisoners. But he isn't about to put troops on the ground to force her hand, so she's been slow walking the process. Of approximately 1,000 behind bars 6 weeks ago, 568 remain in prison, according to the non-governmental organization Foro Penal. This includes 182 members of the military. Those released have been told their cases are still open, and many released political figures have been told not to speak publicly. Ms. Rodriguez is acting rationally. She can't afford to permit the freedoms of speech and assembly that an unconditional release of dissidents would unleash. Her refusal to obey Mr. Trump's orders has the backing of hardline Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, who formally or informally controls many of the weapons in the country. But she also needs to create the appearance of cooperation with Washington. Enter the so-called amnesty law, Kafkaesque piece of legislation to tie the opposition in legal knots while pretending to facilitate a democratic transition. Writing in the Venezuelan daily El Nacional last week, Ramon Escobar Leon, an expert in Venezuelan constitutional law, noted that an amnesty law riddled with exclusions thereby loses its reconciliatory nature and becomes a mechanism for managing the conflict in another form. The regime doubtless understands this. By excluding those who have promoted, instigated, requested, invoked, favored, facilitated, financed, or participated in armed actions or the use of force against national sovereignty, the text does not limit itself to sanctioning specific conduct. Mr. Escobar Leon writes, Ms. Machado, who welcomed the U.S. military intervention that removed Mr. Maduro, comes to mind, but many others too. The breadth of the language allows for expansive interpretations and consequently the possibility of generating new threats of legal persecution, the lawyer notes. The law's exclusions are far from the only trouble Venezuelans face in trying to recover a free and just society. As Mr. Escobar Leon points out, Venezuelan laws on the books can be used to equate opposition with terrorism, and the so-called law against hatred must be repealed if effective reconciliation is to be achieved. The end of one era cannot be proclaimed while the legal instruments that made the previous era possible remain in place. The amnesty law asks the U.S. to forget the regime's crimes, but makes clear the regime won't forget Venezuelan resistance to its rule. That's no transition. It's more tyranny. Letters to the editor, The State of Our Union's Political Dysfunction. Peggy Noonan dismisses President Trump's State of the Union address as spectacle and propaganda, but she misses the struggle for the nation's identity. What she calls Crazy Town is actually the division between two senses of America. For nearly a century, one side has meticulously built a managed architecture of bureaucracy and safety nets. They sit in stony silence because they are watching their life's work being systematically dismantled. Conversely, the president is attempting a radical reclamation of the try-hard ethos of free market capitalism. To Miss Noonan, awarding honors in the chamber is vulgar theatrics. To those of us who believe the American engine has been stalled by decades of government overreach, these moments are a celebration of the excellence only a free society can produce. When one side fights to preserve a 90-year-old legacy and the other fights to reclaim a stolen system, the decorum of the past is a luxury we can no longer afford. We are fighting for the soul of the country, and nobody is going to be the first to stop shouting. By Mark Giannitti, Rochester, New York. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows a man at a computer typing as he is blindfolded. The caption, "Don't worry, this is how I filled out last year's taxes too." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 2nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening.